It is member-supported Hawaii Public Radio and all things considered. I'm Dave Lawrence. We are at the Blaisdell Concert Hall, and it's kind of a reunion. It was in the summer of 2011 that Gerry, Beckley, and Dewey, Bunnell of America were here, and we did this exact same thing, and we're all still here, so God bless both of you, and great to see you again.
Thank you very much. Great to be back in paradise.
Yeah, and great to see you again, Dewey.
Thanks, Dave. Nice to be here.
Was it the Homecoming record that you had the vest? I mean, it was like almost like the same look. If you remember,
nothing changes. We're stuck in the past.
And did your family, last time we talked, you were telling me about your son lived on the Big Island, your grandson, and we were talking all about that. Did they come over for these?
Actually, my grandson I will see tomorrow in Maui with his mother, but my son can't make it. But yeah, there's a connection here. We talked about it, I think, a little bit. And Sasha, the mother's side, Sasha and her family are all from Lanai and Maui, so thus they'll be there in Maui tomorrow.
Okay. So that's where they'll show up. And in between the last time that we had you guys, Lost and Found came out, and last album, New Originals, it was in 2015. And I was curious about a couple things relating to it. First, how much of that do you guys work into the show?
Well, there's a bit of it in. We do Drivin' now. It's featured in the show, and that's really stuck. Sometimes when you mess up the running order a little bit, it works for a little bit, and then you put it back to how you had it. But Drivin' is really stuck, and then we've also gone through the whole catalog of other albums, which is pretty numerous. And we've
from the Harbor record that we made in Kauai. We're doing that, and what else are we doing? Greenhouse
from Hourglass. We were crediting Hourglass, saying an album from the 80s, and a fan yelled out, no, it was the 90s. We were off by a decade.
That stuff happens. We were just joking about stuff like that. I was thinking about your parents, and because we were talking the other day about how you guys came together, which was a very unique European thing, but I never got the answer to, did your mom and dad help bring the music to you when you were little kids? Because I know we know the story as teenagers on, but what got you first into music? Was there exposure in the home?
Well, there was. Both my mom and my dad loved music, and my dad liked commercial singer stuff, and
don't worry, it's pretty directional. What do you need?
I think my wife. Sorry. Thank you. I know. Thank you.
We thought that would stop some of the leakage.
So to answer your question, thank you. They listen to music all the time. I've heard Dewey talk about the music you heard growing up with your mom and dad.
Yeah, I think our parents, basically we were little kids in the 50s, moved into the 60s, and so there was a lot. My mother used to listen to Della Reese, and there was this guy, Martin Denny, who did a lot of, there were jungle sounds, and got me into sound effects and things and music. You didn't put those two together.
Those early lounge records, I know exactly.
Yeah.
Exotica, they called it.
So all that, and of course all of the rock stuff, Elvis, and of course the crooners and that kind of music was played in our house a lot. But once we shifted into the 60s, and I actually picked up my first guitar, it was like surf instrumental music, the Ventures and the Surfaris and bands. That's what Dick Dale and the Deltones, single note stuff I could learn.
Well, the thing I guess that was occurring to me was, you start up. It's the late '60s. There's this anti-war movement because Vietnam is raging. You guys are all children of military folks. You're abroad. You start out, you've got long hair, you're bringing in this counterculture crowd. Were your parents supportive of this route that you were taking? Did they ever look at it and go, especially before the success came, were they kind of looking at it you ought to do something a little more, you'd be a doctor, be a lawyer?
It's a good point, and I know both parents, both sets of parents were very supportive. Now, having said that, it was a very short. They didn't have to wait very long. The success hit very quickly. So I think any kind of reservations they might have had were short-lived, because we had a big hit, right at the start. So everybody got on board, and it was a wonderful time.
Can you remember anything specific, like a rewarding moment, especially you? You write A Horse with No Name. Very quickly, as Gerry just pointed out, it becomes a big hit. It's making a huge impact on people. Do you just remember a moment where the folks, just something where you felt like, wow, they really realize I've made this happen for myself?
Yeah, my mother was very supportive. She was always kind of a bit artistic herself, and sort of loved showbiz and things. So just the fact that we were playing in front of crowds. My mother was British, as was Gerry's, but I'll never forget we'd made the first album, and Horse with No Name and a few other songs we'd written post that album, and we were playing. My parents had relocated to Yorkshire, where my mother was from in England. They got a pub after my dad retired, and they came to the show, and we were playing Horse with No Name for the first time, and she says, "I really like that song about the horse. I think that's a winner, you know." So she kind of had the ear, I guess, early on, because it was more of a novelty, to be honest, I thought, when we put all our money on I Need You as the very first single. But as the powers would be, Warner's had said, "Have you got any other stuff?" The album had come out already without Horse.
Right, because you re-released it, adding that and a few other ones to it, right?
Yeah, we'd written...
like 3 or 4 or something like that, too.
I'd written Don't Cross the River. You'd written...
No. What we did is we put out what was called a maxi single at the time.
Okay, like an EP?
Yeah, there was an EP thing. And so they added just Horse to the U.S. release, but there is some 3...
from California.
And Sandman were with Horse on a 3-track single.
And then we re-recorded Everyone I Meet is from California and called it California Revisited for the second album. Isn't that the way it worked?
And that's so you mentioned Sandman. That's another tune that has this reference point with what was going on politically and culturally with the war. And again, coming from your background, if you can just talk about how the origins of that, these are things that we have not previously covered.
Well, we were young. We were 17 and 18. We weren't exactly fully matured politically or otherwise, but obviously our generation was affected by the Vietnam War immensely because we were all of draft age. Stuff was happening. We were in a military family. And living at the base there in London, even though it wasn't a fighter base, Lakenheath was, but we were at Mildenhall, more of an administrative base. And a lot of GIs were coming through on their way back from Vietnam, or they were doing R&R, what do they call it, debriefing and so on. So they were billeted there, coming and going. So we heard stories and met people, and I always remember one guy, whether it was secondhand or not, saying the thing that was worse for him was not being able to sleep when you're on those front lines. And I can see myself thinking any moment, there's ambushes, there's snipers, there's whatever. And so physically sleeping was difficult. So Sandman, I understand you've been running from the man, that goes by the name of the Sandman. That was kind of a loose reference to that sort of thing. But again, the Vietnam War was cast in different lights all around the world. Obviously, we were expatriates at that point in England, and we were seeing the British news take on things. And there's a stigma already developing about involvement in that war and Americans and so on. I think all of that lumped together in some way to our name, America, and it was a way to reference who we were, American kids, teenagers, if you will. And so it was, all of that everything happened so quickly, really. When I look back now, after 47 years in the business and touring as much as we have and all over the world, to think how quick all that happened straight out of high school, summer of '69, record deal in early '70, and the record comes out in '71. All of that was mushed together, in our minds as this one giant event. And then here we are tonight, still performing it.
It's gigantic. Oh, it's huge.
It's massive, as they say in Australia. We've just come from Australia.
It's big league.
Big league, yeah.
As some people say.
Yeah. And there's that.
Right, exactly. Right. We'll leave it there. We don't want to get too far. And one final thing before we wrap. You mentioned the expat thing, and we just had Gerry on the other day. He was telling some great stories about early gigs. And I remember one of the first big ones, you didn't really talk about it, but you mentioned it had been opening for The Who. That was December 20th, 1970, the Roundhouse. Wow. And that was your first really, really big gig. And obviously it's in England. You don't remember that, or do you?
Yeah, I remember that. It was actually Elton John and The Who. We were put on...
Osibisa, an African.
Yeah, it's... and we'd played with The Who also at the Oval with Rod Stewart and the Faces at the time.
And interacted all with them?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, we talked. We got to know Ronnie Wood pretty well. Gerry and Ronnie came and lived at Gerry's house in L.A. in that interim between the Faces and the Stones. So we got tight with them then.
We were close with Harry Nielsen was a dear friend right from the start, and he was very tight with Keith Moon, so we hung with Keith quite a bit.
Oh, wow. That's cool. All right. Well, that paints...
We're very fortunate. Key, they say timing is everything, the place and the time. We were very lucky to have met a key figure, a guy named Jeff Dexter in London, who was a compere / DJ, who, he introduced Hendrix at the Isle of Wight. So he was connected. He had a lot of, and they embraced us. He and his roommate at the time, who turned out to be a Warner's exec / producer. Wow. And so it was pure, it was. And he put us on the bill in front of the Pink Floyd, The Who, Elton John. We ended up just thrown on the bill in front of the band, which was unique. That was in Amsterdam. Just lucked into that when the band were touring, and one promoter said to somebody else, "Hey, who's around?" We were playing a tour of Holland, small clubs and stuff. But I think Gerry mentioned to you about our big kind of ace booking was to be the opening act for Cat Stevens' tour of Europe. That was a great thing. Yeah, I was going to say, you knew the dates.
Well, then that was the reason. And the final question, the reason I mentioned the UK show was, the one thing I never have read about is there, that's this big debut in the UK, you're an expat band. Eventually you come to America. Was the first gig in America a significant gig when you finally get to the United States? And if you could, that'll be our final question.
It was a great time. We actually came over and did a warm-up show in Kitchener, Ontario. So that's officially North America, but it's not the States. We played in a lunchroom at a university in Kitchener. But then we came down and we did a week with the Everly Brothers at the Cellar Door in D.C. And Horse was out, and it was the biggest record in the country, and so there were lines around the block, and we were booked to do 20 minutes, 30 minutes as an opening act. So everybody watched our set, and then they'd leave when the Everlys came out. And the Everlys were fantastic, and they had Waddy Wachtel on guitar, Warren Zevon on keyboards. It was an unbelievable band, and it was just one of those bad timing things. So the next week we were supposed to do the same thing in a place called Lenny's on the Turnpike in Boston, and we were going to do 20 minutes, and mysteriously the Everlys got sick and canceled. So we got bumped up to headliner, and we said, we don't really have a whole show, and they said, it's okay, we got this comic named Jay Leno, college kid. He's going to do the week. So we worked with Jay in February of '72 in a snowy little motel in Boston. Yeah, it was a good time.
And then our big debut in New York was at the Bitter End, a legendary club there in the Village, opening for Robert Klein, the comedian. So we did a week there, and each day, incrementally, the record was breaking here and there. We'd get reports, Kansas City, it's #1, St. Louis, whatever. And so by the end of that tour, 5 weeks, we ended up at the Whiskey for a week in L.A. By then, the record was #1. It had been #1 in England just before we flew out, and it turned #1. Did 5 weeks or 2 months, whatever it was, in the U.S.
At #1?
And it went to #1.
It went #1, yeah.
It was it was #1 in each country as we were kind of flying to and from. But all of that was just part of that whirlwind thing where, we just
do that song tonight.
Let's try
What's that?
We should do that one tonight. Just
relive the moment, man.
It's a great thing to relive these moments. You've been very generous with your time. It's Gerry Beckley, it's Dewey Bunnell, it's the band America. You have fun. Thank you for doing this.
Hey, great to see you. Yeah, fun.
Really great. And we love the show, by the way. So, and NPR in general is a great thing, something we all wish you would support more.
Well, thank you.
All things considered.
And great to have you with you. You're welcome.